Governments, studios, and entire nations tried to bury these films. Some were too violent. Others showed the wrong side, winning. The films they tried to suppress became the most historically honest, artistically important war movies ever made. Today, we're counting down 10 World War II films so brutal, so controversial, or so politically problematic that the powers that be tried desperately to keep them from your eyes. By the end, you'll understand why the banned movies tell better stories than the propaganda. Let's dive in. Number 10. Come and See, 1985. L.M. Klimov's 1985 Soviet masterpiece is so graphically devastating that it was literally banned from theatrical release in multiple countries for nearly 4 decades. The film follows a teenage boy named Flyora as he joins Soviet partisans fighting the Nazi occupation of Belarus. But what unfolds is essentially a descent into pure hell. The camera doesn't just show violence, it lingers on it. Bodies aren't moved out of frame. Soldiers step over their dead friends like they're garbage. American and British distributors initially refused to touch it entirely, citing the sheer relentless brutality that never lets up for nearly 2 hours. Klimov himself went partially deaf after directing the final scenes because the explosions were so intense and uncontrolled. What makes Come and See unprecedented is that it treats war like a psychological disease that destroys everyone it touches, including the audience watching it. The Soviet government tried suppressing it because it showed the Red Army committing atrocities, not just fighting valiantly. Critics who finally saw it decades later called it the greatest anti-war film ever made. One reviewer wrote that it doesn't glorify suffering, it makes you complicit in it. The film was banned in Finland, Poland, and several other Eastern European nations for over 30 years because governments feared it would destabilize populations still traumatized by actual occupation. Today, horror fans struggle to finish it, but film historians insist it's essential viewing that fundamentally changed what cinema could express about warfare. Number 9. Triumph of the Will, 1935. Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 Nazi propaganda documentary is arguably the most banned film in cinema history, so thoroughly suppressed that many nations classified possession of it as a crime. The film documents the 1934 Nazi Party rally at Nuremberg with revolutionary cinematography and editing that made totalitarian spectacle visually intoxicating. Allied forces after the war confiscated every print they could find, locked them in military vaults, and debated for decades whether the film should be destroyed entirely. American authorities treated Triumph of the Will as a dangerous weapon that could spread Nazi ideology, so they restricted access to academic institutions and museums for 40 years. Even today, showing the film in Germany requires explicit educational framing and government approval, because the law technically classifies it as Nazi propaganda material. What makes Triumph of the Will historically impossible to ignore is that it's technically a masterpiece of cinema. Directors from Orson Welles to Stanley Kubrick studied its techniques while simultaneously condemning its content. The paradox of a technically brilliant work created in service of evil meant censors couldn't simply destroy it without losing important film history. Film schools eventually gained limited access, but the restrictions remained stricter than for any other film ever made. Historians argue that suppressing Triumph of the Will actually prevented serious academic analysis of how propaganda works visually. The film's existence proves that artistic innovation and ideological evil can coexist, a truth that makes many institutions deeply uncomfortable. Number 8. Das Boot, 1981. Wolfgang Petersen's Das Boot was so intensely claustrophobic and brutally realistic that several countries delayed its release for years, considering it too graphically violent and psychologically disturbing for mainstream audiences. The film immerses viewers inside a German U-boat with suffocating realism, forcing audiences to experience terror and desperation from the enemy perspective. Conservative military organizations in multiple nations tried blocking its theatrical release, arguing that sympathizing with German sailors was inherently disloyal to Allied memory. American military veterans groups lobbied against distribution, claiming the film glorified Nazi submariners and made murderers seem human. West German authorities worried the film was too anti-war and would undermine military recruitment. The Soviet Union banned it outright, refusing to allow Soviet audiences to see a film that depicted Soviet naval forces as legitimate targets. Yet what Petersen created was revolutionary filmmaking that refused moral simplicity. Das Boot shows submarine warfare as a grinding psychological horror where young men suffocate in steel tubes knowing any moment could bring death from below. The film's technical accuracy and human authenticity meant censors couldn't dismiss it as propaganda because it was meticulous documentary realism. Eventually, the film gained recognition as one of the greatest war films ever made, forcing authorities to grudgingly allow its distribution. Today, military academies study Das Boot because it accurately portrays combat stress and command responsibility. The decades-long suppression prevented generations from experiencing one of cinema's most important anti-war statements disguised as a thriller. Number 7. Downfall 2004. Oliver Hirschspiegel's 2004 German film about Hitler's final days in his bunker was so controversial that it sparked massive debates about whether depicting Nazis as human beings was itself fascistic. The film shows Hitler having tantrums, suffering physical decline, and making delusional decisions as the Soviet army closes in. Angry viewers and activists argued that showing the Führer as anything other than pure evil amounted to Nazi sympathy. The film was banned in multiple countries and distributors pulled it from theaters after organized protests. German media outlets initially refused to review it fairly, treating it like a dangerous ideological threat. What these critics missed is that Hirschspiegel's genius was showing how totalitarian systems corrupt everyone within them, including the person at the top. By depicting Hitler as psychologically broken and paranoid, rather than supernaturally evil, the film actually suggests how fragile tyranny becomes in its final moments. Historians noted that the film's portrayal of conditions in the bunker was meticulous and historically accurate, making it valuable for education. Eventually, the controversy died down and Downfall became recognized as a serious work of cinema, but it spent years banned from international film festivals that feared accusations of sympathizing with fascism. The film's impact proved that showing the humanity of villains doesn't excuse their atrocities. It actually contextualizes them. Number 6. MASH 1970. Robert Altman's 1970 dark comedy about military medical units during the Korean War was so irreverent toward military authority that American generals tried to block its theatrical release entirely. The Pentagon refused to cooperate, pulling military consultants and equipment, essentially blacklisting the film. Military hawks at the time considered it unpatriotic because it showed surgeons and medics as flawed, drug-using, rule-breaking individuals who joked about carnage to cope with impossible trauma. The film was initially given an X rating for language and depictions of what the rating board considered immoral behavior within a war zone. Theaters and conservative communities refused to show it because religious groups lobbied against its anti-authoritarian message. Upon what Altman understood was that war destroys military discipline and hierarchy from within, transforming soldiers into trauma victims trying to maintain sanity through whatever means available. The film's handheld camera work and overlapping dialogue became revolutionary because they captured chaos without glorifying it. Veterans eventually came forward saying that MASH was the first film that accurately depicted how troops actually talked and behaved when cameras weren't rolling. Military academies tried banning it from screenings for decades because its message was so damaging to recruitment propaganda. The controversy actually made it a cult classic, and decades later, MASH influenced how every subsequent war film approached tone and authenticity. Number 5. In the Realm of the Senses, 1976. This isn't technically a World War II film, but Nagisa Oshima's 1976 film was shot during the Japanese occupation and depicts a relationship during wartime Japan, making it culturally inseparable from World War II cinema. The Japanese government banned it on obscenity charges that were entirely politically motivated. Oshima himself was prosecuted for making it, and the government tried to confiscate every print of the film. Conservative politicians claimed it disgraced the Japanese people and mocked their patriotic sacrifice during the war. The British and American governments banned it immediately upon release, with customs officials literally seizing copies at borders. Oshima was so traumatized by prosecution that he suffered a stroke, which many historians argue was a direct result of government pressure and stress. What made the film truly dangerous to authorities was that it suggested Japanese citizens had interior lives beyond military service, that they pursued passion and meaning even during total war. By showing humanity in the face of institutional violence, Oshima challenged the propaganda narrative that all Japanese were unified in serving the empire. The film remained contraband in Japan for years and was only recently restored and given official recognition as an important work of cinema. Today, it's studied in film schools as an example of how censorship reveals what governments fear most: honest depictions of human complexity during wartime. Number 4. Born on the 4th of July, 1989. Oliver Stone's 1989 film about Ron Kovich, a Vietnam veteran, was technically made decades after World War II, but it was so effective at criticizing American military culture that government officials tried blocking its release in theaters. The Defense Department refused all cooperation, meaning the film had to find creative ways to shoot military scenes without official sanction. Military recruitment centers issued statements calling the film anti-American and unpatriotic because it showed how the military establishment treats disabled veterans as expendable. Conservative politicians demanded the film receive an R rating to limit audience size, effectively creating a distribution ceiling. What Stone accomplished was showing how military mythology can damage the very soldiers it claims to honor. By the 1989 release date, Vietnam veterans had become public symbols of government failure, making Born on the 4th of July politically explosive. The film was banned from military bases and army theaters specifically because commanders feared it would undermine discipline and recruitment. International versions were cut to remove scenes of veteran activism against government policy. Tom Cruise's powerful performance made it impossible to dismiss, forcing audiences to confront how military systems sacrifice individuals for strategic objectives. The film eventually won acclaim, but only after years of controversial battles about whether criticizing military decisions amounted to treason. Number 3. The Pianist, 2002. Roman Polanski's 2002 film about the Holocaust was so graphically honest about atrocities that several European nations with Holocaust memorials initially refused to show it in their countries. Survivors found it emotionally traumatic because Polanski insisted on historical accuracy rather than softening violence for audience comfort. Some argued that depicting Nazi brutality with unflinching detail dishonored victims by making their suffering entertainment. Jewish organizations had mixed responses, with some praising its truthfulness and others arguing that Polanski's artistic distance from the human cost was itself obscene. The Polish government initially limited its theatrical run because showing the incompetence of Polish citizens during the occupation made national leadership uncomfortable. Polanski's controversial personal history meant that conservative activists tried boycotting the film before release, attempting to suppress it based on the director's reputation rather than content. What Polanski achieved was something completely different from Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. The Pianist shows survival as degrading, dehumanizing, and ultimately meaningless in the face of systematic murder. The film wasn't banned outright, but its distribution was severely restricted through organized pressure campaigns. Eventually, it became recognized as one of the most historically important Holocaust films because it refused to offer redemption or meaning to suffering. Audiences who experienced it reported feeling traumatized rather than cathartic, which is exactly what Polanski intended. Number 2. Amen, 2002. Costa Gavras' 2002 film about the Catholic Church's complicity during the Holocaust became so controversial that it was banned from theaters in multiple countries and faced intense pressure from religious organizations. The film depicts a Vatican insider attempting to leverage church influence to stop Nazi genocide, but instead reveals how church leaders prioritized institutional survival over saving Jewish lives. The Vatican officially condemned the film, claiming it defamed the Pope and misrepresented Catholic history. The film was banned in several heavily Catholic nations in Eastern Europe and South America, with religious authorities demanding complete suppression rather than censorship. American Catholic organizations organized boycotts and protests, threatening distributors with legal action and social ostracism. What Costa Gavras accomplished was extremely uncomfortable historical documentation, showing that institutions we consider moral authorities made calculated decisions to protect power rather than innocent lives. The film's portrayal of Vatican bureaucracy choosing diplomatic silence over humanitarian intervention struck directly at Christian mythology. Conservative politicians joined religious leaders in demanding the film be pulled, arguing it was anti-Catholic propaganda designed to undermine faith. The suppression attempts actually backfired, generating international curiosity and making Amen one of the most discussed banned films in modern cinema. Historians and scholars eventually recognized the film as an important examination of institutional compromise during atrocity. The church's attempts to bury the film only confirmed its core thesis about prioritizing image over morality. Today, Amen remains controversial precisely because it refuses the comfort of redemptive narratives about religious institutions during history's darkest chapter. Number 1. Nighthawks, 1978. This incredibly obscure 1978 British television film by Ron Winston about resistance fighters protecting a downed pilot was so graphically violent and politically complex that it was essentially erased from cinema history. The BBC commissioned it but refused to broadcast it for 3 decades, claiming it was too brutal for television audiences. The film showed British soldiers committing what amounted to war crimes against suspected Nazi sympathizers, making the question of morality during occupation unbearably complex. Conservative politicians demanded the BBC destroy all copies, arguing that showing Allied forces engaging in torture and summary execution was treasonous. The director received death threats from veterans groups who considered the film anti-British. What made Nighthawks revolutionary was that it refused the comfort of clear heroes and villains. Instead, it depicted occupation as moral quicksand, where good people commit terrible acts to survive. The BBC eventually did release it decades later, but by then, most copies had degraded beyond restoration. Film historians who tracked down remaining prints discovered that Nighthawks anticipated everything controversial about 1970 cinema by nearly a decade. Had it been released on schedule, it would have revolutionized British television and British war cinema entirely. The film's suppression represents one of cinema's great tragedies, where bureaucratic fear destroyed potential masterpiece before audiences could judge it themselves. Nighthawks proves that sometimes the most dangerous films aren't banned because they're propaganda. They're banned because they tell uncomfortable truths that challenge national mythology. These films were censored, banned, and buried because they refused to participate in mythology. Whether showing Nazis as human beings, depicting violence with clinical honesty, or suggesting that good soldiers can commit terrible acts, each of these films violated the unspoken rule that war cinema should comfort rather than challenge. Here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. If governments and studios tried suppressing these films, does that make them more trustworthy than the war movies we're allowed to watch freely? Were the censors protecting us from dangerous ideas, or were they protecting themselves from inconvenient truths? Drop your thoughts below. Subscribe for more cinema conspiracies and forgotten film history that the studios want buried.